Hello. Today we'll be looking at a theme that is common to many works of literature. And this theme is where the strong take advantage of the weak. A novel where this is clearly shown is Animal Farm.
In the novel Animal Farm by George Orwell, animals take over the farm, the pigs take control, and use the not as smart, mentally weak animals. This shows an example of stronger power taking advantage of the weak. They use fear of the humans returning as a tactic for keeping control, saying if they don't keep control, the humans will return. They forced the other animals to work for them because they thought the humans would return if they did not. The pigs took advantage of the dumb animals for their personal gain.
And even though the pigs were not necessarily stronger than the other animals, they still dominated them through sheer intellect. And that is the case not only in works of literature, but also in the world today and in the past. This theme is shown through the imperialism with China. Before China faced imperialism, the Chinese government was ruled by the Qing dynasty. And by 1800, China was a prosperous country with a highly developed agricultural system. China was not industrialized, but workers in small workshops were able to produce most of the goods the Chinese needed. Because China was practically self-sufficient, its emperors had little interest in trading with Europeans. For decades, Europeans could do business only at the port of Canton. Despite pleas from British and other nations, China refused to open other ports to foreigners. The Chinese regarded European goods as inferior to their own and bought few goods from the European merchants at Canton. As a result, China began to face a lot of pressure from major European countries.
The British merchants did, however, find a resource they could trade with the Chinese: opium. The British got this opium by importing it from India, then into China. Opium addict numbers grew in China, and the demand for opium increased. It caused social instability. At the time, the Chinese government became worried that foreign missionaries were reforming the citizens and changing their culture. The Qing dynasty began to get tough on addressing the opium problem. Emperor Dao Guang had a high-ranking official named Lin Zhu use his army. They traveled to Hong Kong factories and stopped supply for 6 weeks until the British gave China more than 20,000 chests of opium, even though the Chinese were not trading. In response, the Chinese dumped the opium into trenches and mixed them with lime. Hostilities grew between China and Britain until November 1839, when Chinese ships were blown up by the British. This started the First Opium War.
The reason why the British Empire imperialized China was because there was a very high demand for Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain in the British market. Also, many missionaries from Britain wanted to teach the Chinese about Christianity, because during that time, the Chinese believed in that their ancestors still lived and guided them. The motives for imperialism were economically and religiously based.
Imperialism is when a country dominates the political, economic, and/or social life of another country. There were two different types of imperialism that took place during different time periods. The two types of imperialism were Old and New imperialism. Old imperialism lasted from the 1500s to the 1800s. In Old imperialism, countries would trade with others by setting up ports along their coasts. They did not seek to dominate the country, but to simply acquire wealth. They did this through trade and plundering, and they tried to bring civilization to the countries in the process. New imperialism lasted from 1870 to 1914. Larger nations took control of small, weak nations in order to force them to trade. Their goals were to make the inhabitants work to produce resources for the larger countries.
New imperialism was all about taking advantage of weaker people. The ruling countries were more technologically advanced than the nations they had imperialized, and they used their military to force their protectorates to increase the wealth of the ruling nations, often in a way that did little to benefit the protectorate. A protectorate is a specific type of colony, a country or area that is indirectly controlled by a more powerful nation in exchange for protection. The country has its own rulers and laws, but is still must obey its ruling nation and has obligations to its ruling nation. The obligations may include giving up soldiers to fight for the ruling nation and giving resources to the ruling nation. The reasons that motivated nations to take control of other countries were either economical, political, social, ideological, religious, or exploratory in origin. The countries either wanted raw materials for industrial revolution, trade, cheap labor, or new markets. They wanted to become more powerful by using the countries for bases and getting troops. People wanted to spread their religion and improve the lives of native people, or they wanted to explore these regions. An excuse commonly used by these countries to justify imperialism was the white man's burden.
Major European countries believed that the countries it took control of had people who were half devil, half child. This was a racist depiction of natives as unchristian and in need of parental care. The natives appeared to be evil and capable of committing terrible deeds, and they were also considered to be children because of their seemingly short attention spans and childlike naivete. The ruling countries believed that it was their right as superior people to make inferior people more civilized. It was believed that the British fought with China during the Opium Wars so that the British could gain wealth through trade with China. The Chinese lost those battles, and finally, August 29, 1842, the Treaty of Nanking was signed to end the Opium War between the United Kingdom and the Qing dynasty. It was an unfair treaty that took advantage of the Chinese. The treaty forced the Chinese to trade with British, and the Chinese were also forced to pay the United Kingdom a sum of $21 million over 3 years to pay for the war costs and debts. The 5 ports open for trade were called treaty ports. These ports open for trade were at Shanghai, Canton, Ningpo, Fuzhou, and Amoy. Hong Kong was also given away to the British. The British wanted Hong Kong because of its location. It's on an island that has great access to trade between China, Southern Asia, and the rest of the world.
The way Britain treated China was sordid, which means degrading and scandalous. The British forced the Chinese to trade with them, and oftentimes the British merchants cheated Chinese merchants by giving them less silver than they deserved. Extraterritoriality was also forced upon the Chinese. This was where the British, living in China, did not have to abide by the rules of the Chinese and only the laws of the British. The poor treatment of the Chinese by the British, and the British wanting to set up more ports, caused the Second Opium War. The Chinese once again lost and were forced to establish more treaty ports. Around this time, other nations set up spheres of influence within China, which guaranteed specific trading rights to each respective nation within their spheres. The U.S. was not one of the nations to establish a sphere of influence in China, and because the U.S. also wanted to gain wealth from trade with China, the U.S. proposed and established the open door policy. The policy was proposed by Secretary of State John Hay and dispatched to the major European nations in 1899.
The U.S. had some good intentions when proposing the open door policy, but like France, Germany, Japan, Britain, and Russia, the U.S. was looking to use China for its resources. Imperialism had some benefits, but of the benefits of imperialism in Japan, negatively impacted China. The First Sino-Japanese War, August 1st, 1894 to April 17th, 1895, was fought between the Qing Empire of China and the Japanese Empire for the control of Korea. After more than 6 months of laborious fighting and a large number of victories from the Japanese, the Chinese lost and asked for peace around February 1985. This loss of the Qing Empire demonstrates the failure of China's attempt to modernize its military, which is why it was so easily defeated by other countries seeking to take advantage of it. Japan had grown to power when Western powers began to interact with Japan. After seeing the superiority of the Western powers, Japan quickly adapted during the Meiji period, 1868 to 1912, and became modernized. The Qing dynasty's failure to modernize and their losses eventually led to their Boxer Rebellion and the Nationalist Revolution. In 1900, a secret organization known as the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fists left an uprising in northern China against Westerners. They were against the foreign nations' involvements in China. The Boxers were called Boxers because they performed physical exercises that they believed made them invulnerable. Due to the help of the US, the Boxers were defeated, and China was forced to pay $330 million to the foreign nations involved. The US intervened because US officials believed that if the Boxers succeeded, then the open door policy would no longer be in effect. The Nationalist Revolution came afterward because after previous wars, China had been forced to relinquish ports of its country. Hong Kong was lost in the Opium Wars. After the Sino-Japanese War, China gave up Taiwan and parts of Manchuria. As the Qing dynasty fell, it tried in a final effort to modernize its military. The Qing maintained some control in China, but overseas, Chinese wanted reform or revolution. Kang Yaoi and Liang Qichao became leaders of a proposal for a constitutional monarchy. They were called the Revolutionary Alliance. They revolted then for a republican government, but the Qing army shut down their revolts. In autumn 1911, the Qing started losing and responded to demands making a constitutional monarchy. Yuan Shikai was named the new premier of China. A man named Dr. Sun Yat-sen, the leader of the revolution who was in America fundraising, then went to London and Paris to stop the nations from giving help to the king. Sun Yat-sen was born in a small peasant village of farmers and fishermen south of Canton in Guangdong Province, China. He received a traditional Chinese education there until at age 13 he transferred to missionary schools in Honolulu, Hawaii. This is where he had learned English. After 5 years, he returned to China, who attended Queen's College, and after graduation, he had entered Hong Kong Medical College. 2 years later, he produced a remarkable document that talked about a plan to modernize China. He attempted to present it to Li Hongchang, who was an innovator and general at the time, but Dr. Sun was ignored. Later, he led the secret movement within the Chinese military to overthrow the king, and he succeeded in 1911. He was a skilled orator, public speaker, which was a reason why he was a leader. He had 3 main aims: nationalism, to eliminate the Qing dynasty and foreign imperialism; democracy, to eliminate the monarchy rule through elected government and Western ideas; and economic prosperity, socialism, to improve the lives of peasants. Industry and transportation must be modernized as well. He also planned to take away some land from rich landlords and give it to the people. His overall goal was to restore China to a viable, sovereign nation by removing all things relating to imperialism. When he returned to China after traveling to the European countries, the revolutionaries had taken the former capital of the Ming dynasty, and representatives from the provinces elected Dr. Sun the provisional president of the Republic of China.
After Sun Yat-sen finished modernizing China, China was no longer easily taken advantage of by other countries since it was no longer weaker. Thus, imperialism ended in China, but there had been some positive and negative effects that imperialism had on China. After the open door policy, China was able to trade with other countries, helping it economically. The people of China also got better educated, better sanitation, and many other things due to major European countries trying to modernize China because of the white man's burden. But some negative impacts include they lost a huge part of their culture and traditions. Opium was brought over to China because it was not allowed in Britain. Opium also killed many people because they were addicted to it. They used to think they were the strongest nation in the world, but the effects of imperialism made the Chinese people realize that they weren't the strongest or the smartest people in the world. Many languages and religions were also lost because the Westerners made them change over to what they spoke and believed in. Maybe the most important of all was that the Chinese lost a tremendous amount of money after having paid reparations to foreign nations that they fought with, and they also suffered severe amount of damage due to the fighting and wars.